Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Disney World Q&A. It's a series in which you ask me Disney questions and I give you Disney answers. Sometimes they're opinions, sometimes they're facts, sometimes they're history. It depends. And they're all questions that are pulled from the comments here on the YouTube series. If I don't get to them all through the show, I try to at least answer as many as I can in the actual comments. This episode's going to be a little weird and different because I actually recorded this whole thing and then only to find that the mic wasn't picking up my voice. So I'm actually re-recording all of the answers, even though the video is already here. So if they're a little out of sync or they feel off, that's probably why. I'm doing both at separate times. And I just came from spending about a half hour answering all of these questions. So if these answers seem a little brief, it's probably because I just answered them already, so I know how to get to them more concisely. Anyway, we do have 6 questions this week. They range the gamut, and they're actually pretty great questions. I'm excited about them. And I'm going to jump right in with Alan MGM, who actually leaves a really long question that if you want to read the whole thing beginning to end, you could probably check it out on the last episode in the comments section. It's essentially mostly a summary of what the Disney Renaissance was, which was a period in the 90s where the animation studios at Disney sort of really picked up again and became world-renowned. And Alan basically asks, do you think since 2009 when The Princess and the Frog came out and was received very well that it was starting a second Disney Renaissance, and if I thought that was the case or not and why? So my short answer is I don't think it's a second Disney Renaissance, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And my long answer is that I think what it boils down to is why the first Disney Renaissance was considered a Disney Renaissance. And I think a lot of it is context. And the context was that the Walt Disney Company was in pretty rough shape when Michael Eisner and Frank Wells took over in the mid-'80s. They were at threat of being hostily taken over by other companies, broken up into pieces, sold off for assets. I mean, it's crazy to think of it today, but in the mid-'80s, there was a chance that there would be no Disney company today. And Wells and Eisner turned it around, and now it's, one of the largest, if not the largest, media company in the world. And so I think when people credit the 90s as a Disney Renaissance, I think a big part of that is because they're taking into account the context of the almost going under to becoming this, critically acclaimed, financially massively successful studio. And while I do think that there was a decline in quality in Disney films after about 2000, once the Renaissance ended, up until The Princess and the Frog in 2009, it was almost a full decade where I feel like their movies did dip in quality. And I think part of it was because they didn't have to worry too much because they had Pixar making films with them. And I think part of it was also just a creative lull. But I don't think that coming back to a good trend that we see today with Tangled and Frozen, I don't think that counts as a renaissance, just because I don't think it's coming from as dark of a place as it was in the 80s when, you go from 1984, 1985, where, you didn't think Disney as a company might not have made it, let alone the animation part. And then it becomes, critically acclaimed, winning Academy Awards. It's a big shift, and I think that's why it sort of deserves the name of a Disney Renaissance. So that's my answer. I think it's great that the quality is better. I think it's super great that they bought Pixar, because I think that helps, because you have John Lasseter, and anytime he's involved with the project, I think it gets better than it would have been without him. And I think he's probably the closest you're ever going to see to a Walt Disney after the passing of Walt Disney. Not to put too much on his shoulders, but I think, sometimes you get that vibe from him. But there's a great question. I loved coming up with an answer for that one. Thanks, Alan. Next up, we have Kevin Klinke, who says, "Hey Rob, I saw Saving Mr. Banks, and I noticed Walt Disney and Emma Thompson went on the carousel at Disneyland, but this took place in the 60s, and Fantasyland was carnival tent rides, but it wasn't in the movie. Did you notice that?" So that's not actually the case. So what he's referring to is in Saving Mr. Banks, Tom Hanks plays Walt Disney and Emma Thompson plays P.L. Travers, and there is a bit of the movie where they go to Disneyland, and this movie takes place in the early 1960s, and they go on the carousel in Disneyland. That was actually, I would say, very, very on point as to what Disneyland looked like in the 60s. If you go look up old photographs of Disneyland, specifically Fantasyland from the 1960s, they're pretty spot on. I mean, Fantasyland has always had sort of this mood that sort of feels as close to a classical carnival setup than any of the other lands in Disneyland or Disney World. But it wasn't literally like a carnival tent rides, you know. It was very much still Disneyland. And, you know, I think one of the benefits is a lot of Fantasyland still looks the same. A lot of it, of course, looks different. But, you know, on films, you have members of the crew whose jobs it is to specifically focus on making sure it looks as much as it did in the original within the budget. And Disney has a pretty big budget, so I do think it was pretty, like, after I read your comment, I actually started looking into photos of Disneyland, because that never hit me when I was watching the movie, and I thought maybe I was wrong. But if you look it up, Disneyland, specifically Fantasyland in the 1960s, looked pretty similar to how it was portrayed in the film. Of course, there are probably always going to be minor differences, but for the most part, I think they nailed it. Next up, we have Devin on Minecraft, who asks, I was in Disney on Christmas Day and it was crowded and shut down. How do you think you would control the crowd if you were Disney? So I love this question because I think the answer is kind of creative, and I think the way you control a crowd isn't to physically control a crowd or deal with the crowd. I think the best way to control a crowd, especially in a setting like Disney where it's open all year round and you can plan ahead, is to give them incentive to not be a crowd to begin with. And the way you do that is by offering so much other content in other places that there isn't one spot that everyone bundles up to. I think that's why whenever you occasionally see questions like, you know, will the Animal Kingdom do a Beastly Kingdom after Avatar Land? It's like, I think the answer is no, because everyone's already going to be flocking to Animal Kingdom for Avatar Land. They're probably not going to add a whole lot to Animal Kingdom after that. And likewise, you know, are we going to see a lot of major renovations in the Magic Kingdom once New Fantasyland's all wrapped up? Probably not for a long while, because they already have that New Fantasyland to get people to go there. It's all about spreading it out so everyone has a reason to go somewhere, and it spreads it out and lightens the load a bit. That said, on certain holidays like New Year's or Christmas or Thanksgiving, like, you're going to have major crowds regardless of what you're doing. And it's unfortunate because I don't think there's really a way to get around that. That's just sort of a testament to how popular Disney is, and it's sort of something you have to just work around. And the reason for that is just as a business, it's not going to make any financial sense to make up these workflows or these, you know, establish these new ways to get rid of crowds that are only going to really affect the parks 3, maybe 4 times a year. So that's one of those things where it's just sort of like, if you know you're going to be on Disney on Christmas Day, on New Year's, on Thanksgiving, something like that, then you need to plan ahead and make sure you know how to deal with getting in and getting those crowds. I was there when I was a little kid for the turn of the century, 1999 to 2000 for New Year's, and we had to get to Epcot. We were going to spend New Year's in Epcot, and we had to get there pretty much when the park opened. And luckily, we did that because by noon, the park was to capacity, and they just weren't letting anybody in. And surely the same was going on in the Magic Kingdom and Hollywood Studios, and Animal Kingdom wasn't going to be open for New Year's, I don't think. So that was just sort of, you know, out of luck. But it was just something you had to plan ahead and know that, yeah, it's going to be a big popular day, and you got to account for all those people. That happens with any sort of major event. But good question. I mean, what I would do is just make sure that there's always something new and fresh in each park so that nobody, you know, the crowds don't lump all into one park. Next question is from Andrew11 Hokies, who asks, I have a question for your next Q&A. What park besides any Disney-owned ones is your favorite? Why, and how does it compare to Disney World? I don't think I have a favorite outside of Disney parks. I think Universal's probably the closest you're going to get, though I haven't been there in many, many years. I haven't been to a Six Flags in many, many years. I've been to a Busch Gardens like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. It's one of the things where, I don't get to go to a lot of theme parks. So when I do go, I pretty much just go to Disney. I guess I'd pin it on Universal because they have a Bill and Ted show, and Bill and Ted's like my favorite movie ever, or they used to have a Bill and Ted show. How does it compare? I don't think it does compare. I think it's close. I think Universal is probably the only other park that can come close in terms of theming and quality to Disney, but even then it's got a long way to go. And I think a big part of that is just Disney's got such a head start. Even though Disney World didn't open until the 70s, you got to remember Disneyland opened in the 50s, and that was based on properties that people grew up with from the 40s and the 30s, and Mickey Mouse is the sort of name that spans many, many generations. It's, a matter of parents taking their kids who then take their kids to Disney because they grew up with Disney, and that's not something you can really see with Universal yet. Harry Potter, the Harry Potter land is really big, but what are you going to do there? You don't have a case where somebody's going, well, I grew up as a kid with Harry Potter, and so I'm bringing my kid to Harry Potter. I think we might just be reaching the point where you can see that happen, but the generations aren't old enough yet to really be able to do that. Whereas you have Mickey Mouse where you just have generation after generation, and that sort of gives it an edge. And I think Disney just has a history of, they've been doing this for so long, they know how to do it so great that it puts them above everything else. So I would say it doesn't compare, but I guess Universal is my favorite non-Disney park, although I haven't been to many non-Disney parks recently. Good question, though. And I think the proof's in the pudding. I mean, look at the last question. Disney was crowded and shut down on Christmas. I don't know if that was the case with Universal. That'd be interesting to look into. Next question comes from Irvin Dupius, who asks, hey Rob, thanks for entering the Army. Here's my question. Might want to read each one at a time. Nope, gonna break the rules and read them both at once. Fantasmic was made in California, then Florida, and then Tokyo. If you can change scenes in the actual show, for instance the pirate ship to Florida, what would you do or delete completely? Also, what is your favorite nighttime show from any park, from Wishes, Illuminations, Fantasmic, World of Color? To answer your first question, what would I remove or do differently? Nothing. And that's sort of the thing where I know I enjoy it, I know what I like when I see it, but I don't have the sort of insight to these shows where I can look at a scene and go, well, that's the scene that's not doing it for me. I love Fantasmic, I love all the shows that are there, and I just sort of trust in the company to make something better when they feel like they need to make something better. So I wouldn't do anything with Fantasmic. I like it as is. And I actually only just saw it for the first time a couple of years ago, so it's still fresh to me, Maybe for other people, it's sort of aging a little bit and they want to see new scenes, but I still like it as it is. As for your second question, I would say Illuminations is my favorite night show. And I think the reason for that is, they all have fantastic music and they all have fantastic fireworks, but I love the theme of, this international respect and working together. And it's, it's a very uplifting mood, and having that paired with the visual of seeing all of the pavilions around the lagoon is just a great moment for me. And I love that it adds a level of variety and that I can sort of, each time I watch Illuminations, I could do it from a different pavilion. And even though it's the same show and it's the same music, seeing it from that different angle adds a little bit of variety that you might not get with Wishes, where, I've only ever watched Wishes in two places, the Hub or Main Street, or the Main Street or the Hub, where, I don't think I've seen Illuminations at every single pavilion, so I can't say that I have yet. So that's definitely my favorite. And then last question this week. This is an interesting one, and quite possibly my favorite so far. Madison Washington asks, hey Rob, how come you don't hear anyone else's last name as Disney? Is Walt Disney and his relatives before himself the only ones with the last name Disney? Thanks. So I had to do some research into this. I remember reading about it a bit in his biography, the history, but I wanted to look into it more. I don't think there's an answer in terms of whether the Walt Disney's family tree is the only Disneys out there, but I think there are some explanations as to why it is not a common name. There are still definitely Disneys out there today. They're maybe not in the spotlight I think you lose names a lot due to like marriage and things like that. So that always happens. But I think part of what makes it such a rare name is just sort of where it comes from. So I think with common names like Smith or Baker or, you hear those names, and a lot of times you'd have last names that are based on what the ancestor's profession was. Like that's what they would call themselves, like Baker or Smith, right? In other cases, you get a last name based on where they're from, right? So it's funny. I'm going to be referencing another video game that's not Minecraft related, but Ezio Auditore from Assassin's Creed. His full title is Ezio Auditore di Firenze, and the di Firenze means he's from Firenze in Italy, and that's something that they did back then. And so in France, there was that title of d'Isigny, and that was for people who was from a canton in France called Isigny del Mar, I think Del Mar or de Mer, which is basically by the sea. And so it was a sort of thing you tack on if you were from Isigny del Mar. And the shortening of that was to put a D in front of Isigny, so it'd be Disigny. And then the Americanized version of that was just Disney. And so I think part of why you don't see that name a lot is, one, because it's the result of multiple steps of that sort of name evolving. But also, if you look it up today, Isigny is still a place in France, and the region's population is about 3,000 people. So it's not a very large area. It's not like this is a family that comes from, Paris or some major city, right? So I think part of it is just not a lot of people come from there. So like, how many people came from there? How many people who came from there who used that title and made it part of their last name? And then how many people who did all of that also Americanized it to Disney, right? So I think that's why you don't see a whole lot of it. Although I wouldn't be surprised if you see a whole lot of names, a lot of people taking Disney up as a name because of Walt's fame. Probably more so than if he wasn't famous, how many Disneys there would be. But it's definitely not a common name, though there are plenty other names out there. I really highly suggest, if you're interested in looking into the Disney family history, it's really interesting. I mean, you could either check it out in Walt and Roy's biographies by Bob Thomas. It's like Walt, an American original for Walt, and then Building a Company is Roy's, and they kind of go into it a little bit, and they go into their parents, Elias, and it sort of talks about it just a little bit. But it's really cool. There's your answer. I mean, it's no set answer of this is why there aren't a lot of Disneys, but I think if you look at all of these little pieces and put them together, it sort of paints a picture as to why you don't see many of them. In any case, it's lucky that we had the one that we did have, and look at all this great stuff that came from him. So this series not weekly anymore. This is sort of rolled into Disney in general. The idea is every Saturday is going to be a Disney episode. It might be Walt Disney World, the series where I talk about an attraction. It might be a Q&A like this. It might be a series that I want to kick into more called Revisiting Epcot, where I look over an attraction and I throw in my 2 cents as to how I think it could be even better. And who knows, maybe I'll do like a Revisiting Magic Kingdom and all the other parks after that if you guys like it. So next week you won't have a Q&A, you'll have something different. But please feel free to leave questions in the comments here. Like I said, if I don't get to them all in the episode, I try to at least get to them in the comments themselves. Whatever you're doing this week, make the most of it, because it makes it so much better and so much more enjoyable. And I hope to see you all here next week for the next episode of Minecraft Disney. Bye, everybody.